It was a Saturday morning, and Margaret was doing what she always did on Saturday mornings. She had been going to the farmer's market on the corner of the old square every week for 11 years, always arriving at the same time, always stopping at the same three stalls. The woman who sold tomatoes and always gave her one extra. The old man with the bundles of herbs who never used a scale and always charged the same amount regardless of what she took. The stall at the far end with the dark bread that she bought one loaf of every week without fail. She had her canvas bag. She had her list, though after 11 years, she barely needed it. It was, by every measure, an ordinary Saturday. She paid for the bread. She said goodbye to the woman at the tomato stall. She stepped out of the market and onto the sidewalk and shifted the canvas bag to her other hand and looked up. And there he was, a dog, standing perfectly still on the pavement across the street in the pale morning light of October. Tan coat, white chest, one ear standing straight up and one folded over at the tip. The muzzle almost entirely gray now, where it had once been the color of sand. Heavier than she remembered. Older, visibly and unmistakably older. But the way he stood, the way he held himself without moving and looked directly at her, across the noise of the market and the people passing between them, as if there were a line drawn straight from his eyes to hers, and nothing in the world could interrupt it. That had not changed at all. She had not seen this dog in 8 years. 8 years, 2 months, and 11 days, to be exact, because she had counted every single one of them. And now he was standing 40 feet away from her on a street she had walked down hundreds of times, looking at her as if he had been waiting, as if he had always known exactly where she was and had simply decided that this was the morning he would come. What happened in the next 3 hours, and what she found at the end of those 3 hours inside an abandoned building on the edge of town, is the kind of thing that does not fit neatly into any explanation. Investigators looked at it. A behavioral scientist documented it. A veterinarian wrote about it in a statement she later described as the strangest of her career. And none of them, not one, could fully account for what those animals had been doing out there, or for how long, or why the dog with the folded ear had walked across town that specific morning to find one specific person. But before we get to what was inside that building, we need to go back 8 years, because this story does not begin on a Saturday morning in October. It begins on a Tuesday night in November, with a gate that was latched from the inside, and a dog that should not have been able to disappear. Margaret was 51 years old at the time of the disappearance, and she had lived alone in a modest house on the edge of a quiet town for more than 2 decades. Not a city, not a village. The kind of place where the hardware store has been run by the same family for 3 generations, and the diner closes before 8 in the evening, and everybody recognizes everybody else's car, even if they do not always know the name that goes with the face. Margaret had been a seamstress for most of her adult life, taking in alterations from neighbors and commissions from a bridal shop 2 towns over. She was not a woman who spoke much about what she felt. But she felt things deeply, and the people who knew her well understood the difference. The dog had come into her life 11 years before the night he vanished. He was a mixed breed, the kind of dog that looks assembled from spare parts and somehow works better for it. Somewhere between 40 and 50 pounds. Medium height. A face that was, by any honest measure, unremarkable, except for that one ear that could never decide what it wanted to do. She had named him Boaz, after the man in the Book of Ruth. Her mother had suggested it in her final months, when Margaret had first brought the puppy home. Name him after someone loyal, her mother had said. She had laughed. She had not known then how precise that name would turn out to be. Boaz slept at the foot of her bed every night for 11 years. He sat beside her chair while she worked, close enough to touch, but never in the way. He was at the door every time she left and every time she came back, without a single exception, for 11 years. The kind of constancy that people spend their whole lives looking for in each other and rarely find. Until the Tuesday night in November, when he was not there. Margaret had been working late on an alteration. She let Boaz out into the backyard at 10:15 in the evening. She went back to her work. She intended to call him back inside after a few minutes. She fell asleep in her chair, the way a person does when they have been working too long and the house is too quiet. When she woke up, it was past midnight. The back door was still open. The yard was empty. She called his name into the dark. She walked the perimeter of the yard with a flashlight. She checked the fence on all four sides. She checked the gate at the side of the house. The gate was latched, not broken, not swinging open, not damaged in any way. Latched, from the inside, exactly as she had left it. There was no gap wide enough for a dog his size to squeeze through. There was no sign of digging beneath the fence line, though there was no indication of any kind that anything had forced its way in or out. The yard was simply empty, and the gate was closed, and Boaz was gone. She searched until 3 in the morning. Then she drove every street in the surrounding area until the sun came up. At 7, she called the shelters. At 9, she filed a report with the local police. The officer who took the report was thorough. He noted the detail about the gate. He did not have an explanation for it. The report moved forward without one, and that detail, the gate latched from the inside, sat in the file untouched for 8 years, like a question that everyone had agreed, without saying so, to stop asking. She put up 217 flyers over the following week. She drove to every shelter within a reasonable distance, and then an unreasonable one, every week for the first 2 months. She posted online. She offered a reward. She knocked on doors she had never knocked on before, and asked people she had never spoken to if they had seen a tan dog with a folded ear. Some of them said they would keep an eye out. None of them ever called. After 6 months, the searches slowed. After a year, most people had quietly stopped asking. After 3 years, the subject had effectively closed in every conversation except the ones Margaret had with herself in the middle of the night. She never stopped thinking about the gate. She never stopped thinking about the fact that there was no explanation for it, that the one detail that should have cracked the case open had simply been noted and set aside and left to sit there, unresolved, like a sentence that ends without a period. She prayed. Not loudly, not publicly, but specifically and consistently. She prayed for Boaz by name. She did not ask for explanations. She had given up on explanations by the 2nd year. She asked for resolution. She asked for the story to have an ending, some kind of ending, one she could understand and set down and carry with her without it being so heavy. For 8 years, the prayer had no visible answer. The story had no ending. And Margaret had gotten very good, as people do, at carrying the weight of an open question without letting it show. She left his food bowl in the same spot in the kitchen for 8 years. She never got another dog. Now she was 59, and it was a Saturday morning in October, and she was standing on the sidewalk outside the farmer's market with a canvas bag full of tomatoes and dark bread and a bundle of herbs, and staring at a dog across the street that she had last seen 8 years, 2 months, and 11 days ago. She was aware of every reasonable objection her mind was producing. That it could be another dog. That Boaz would be close to 19 years old, an age that almost no dog of his size reaches. That grief has a known tendency to find the face it loves in the faces of strangers. She understood all of that. She stood there and understood all of it completely. And then the dog turned and began walking slowly away, and it looked back at her once, just once, and she followed him. She set the canvas bag down on the sidewalk next to the market entrance, and she followed him, leaving the tomatoes and the bread and the herbs and the ordinary Saturday morning behind her on the pavement. The pace was not hurried. It was deliberate, steady. The dog stayed 30 to 40 feet ahead of her and maintained that distance with a consistency that did not feel accidental. When she slowed, he slowed. When she stopped once to check her phone, she looked up to find him stopped as well, turned toward her, waiting. He was not sniffing the ground. He was not distracted by other smells or sounds or the people still moving around the edges of the market behind them. He moved through the streets of that town with the focused, efficient movement of an animal that knows exactly where it is going and has been planning the route for some time. She called her sister from the street, keeping her voice low without knowing why, and said that she was following a dog she believed was Boaz, and that she did not know where he was leading her. Her sister asked how that was possible, Margaret said she did not know. She kept walking. The route the dog took was not random. She understood this gradually, the way you understand something when the evidence keeps stacking up, and your resistance to it keeps costing you too much energy to maintain. He avoided the main road entirely. He moved through side streets and the northern edge of the town park, and then out past the back end of the commercial district, toward the part of town that most people had no practical reason to visit anymore. The old grain storage facilities, a cluster of corrugated metal structures that had been sitting empty for 15 years. Gravel roads, overgrown lots. The end of the town that the town had quietly turned its back on. The dog walked that entire route without hesitating at a single turn. No, not once. Not at any intersection. He moved as if he had walked it 1,000 times, as if the path had been memorized long ago and did not require any thought at all. By 9:15, they were past the last street with houses on it. The road had turned to gravel, and the buildings visible from it were all dark and sealed. Margaret had called her sister again and given her location as best she could describe it. She kept walking. The cold had settled into her hands. She had not eaten. She had been following a dog through a town she had lived in for 20 years, and she was seeing parts of it she had never had a reason to look at closely. And the dog ahead of her walked with the same unhurried certainty it had maintained for the past hour and 15 minutes. At 10:03, the dog stopped. There was a structure ahead of them, set back from the road and partially screened by a cluster of trees that had grown up around it unchecked over the years. A large storage building from the old grain operation. Corrugated metal walls, faded and rust-streaked. A wide sliding door on one side, partially open, wide enough for a person to pass through. The roof intact on the near side, collapsed inward on the far end. Abandoned, visibly and completely, in the way that buildings absorb abandonment over time, and begin to look like they were always empty, like they were built to be forgotten. The dog walked to the sliding door and sat down in front of it. He did not go inside. He sat and turned and looked at her, and he waited. And Margaret stood in the gravel road 15 feet away and heard something coming from inside the building. A low sound, rhythmic, not mechanical, not the settling of old metal in the morning air. Something else entirely. She took a step forward, then another. She reached the door and looked inside, and for a long moment she could not make sense of what she was seeing. Her brain received the information and refused to arrange it into any shape she recognized. She stepped through the door. The interior was lit by the gap in the collapsed section of the roof, a wide column of pale morning light falling onto the floor near the center of the space. And in that light, she saw the following. The floor had been covered in nesting material. Not debris that had blown in over the years. Arranged nesting material. Hay, the dried leaves, strips of insulation pulled from the walls, scraps of fabric from sources that could not be immediately identified. All of it gathered and shaped into a wide, dense, flattened circle on the floor, something close to 6 feet across. And in that circle, there were 11 animals. Not feral, not cornered, not in distress. 11 dogs of different sizes and breeds, some of them lying down, some of them with their heads raised, all of them watching her with a stillness that was not fear. Around the outer edge of the circle, their bodies were oriented outward, toward the walls of the building, toward the door, as if they were facing something that might come from any direction. And in the center of the circle, pressed against a large brown dog who lay on his side and was breathing slowly, was a cat. Old, visibly old, eyes cloudy, so moving only slightly. The brown dog at the center was dying. That was clear from the doorway. His breathing was labored and slow, and he did not lift his head when Margaret stepped inside. But the 10 dogs arranged around him, forming a living wall between him and the cold and the open door, those dogs did not move from their positions. They watched her. They remained exactly where they were. And the sound she had heard from the road, the low, rhythmic sound that had pulled her through the door, was coming from them. Several of them were producing a low, steady vocalization. Not quite a whine, not quite a hum. Something between the two. Something that had no precise name in any clinical description she would later encounter. She stood in that building for a long time before the full shape of what she was looking at became clear to her. These animals had not gathered here by accident. The nesting material had been brought here and arranged with purpose. The positioning of the outer dogs, bodies oriented away from the center, was not random. This had been constructed. This had been maintained. Something had decided that the animals at the center needed to be kept warm, needed to be shielded, needed to be stayed with. And something had stayed, through cold nights and empty days, in an abandoned building at the edge of a town that had forgotten the building existed. Over the following weeks, as she returned with food and water, and eventually with help, the identities of the animals in that building began to emerge. Of the 11 dogs, the 9 were matched to missing animal reports filed in the area. Some had been missing for months, others for years. The oldest report was for a dog who had been missing for 4 years, 8 months, and 14 days. The cat, a small gray female, had been reported missing 6 years before, that Saturday morning, by a woman who lived 2 streets from Margaret. The cat was estimated to be more than 20 years old. She was alive. The large brown dog at the center, the one the others had surrounded and stayed with, and kept warm through what the evidence would later suggest was not just one night, but many months, was never identified. No microchip, no match to any missing report in the region, or in any adjacent region that was searched. No known origin. He had come from nowhere that anyone could find. And he had gathered those animals around him, or been gathered by them. And the question of which of those two things was true is one that no investigator ever resolved. He died 3 days after Margaret found the building, at a veterinary clinic, calmly and without distress. The veterinarian who was present wrote in her notes that she had been practicing for 19 years and had never observed an animal die with that particular quality of stillness. She used the word peaceful. Then she crossed it out and wrote it again, because it was the only word that fit. The behavioral biologist who later examined the case and reviewed the veterinary records and the layout of the building and the estimated duration of the animal's presence there. It's because evidence in the nesting material and the surrounding ground suggested they had been using the structure for at least 2 years. That biologist published a careful and honest assessment. He described sentinel behavior in canine groups. He described thermoregulatory clustering in animals under stress. He described how semi-feral dogs sometimes form protective structures around injured or dying companions. He used the word remarkable several times. He also wrote, in the final paragraph of his assessment, that he could not fully account for the consistency of the behavior over the estimated time period, or for the composition of the group, which included animals from enough different points of origin that their convergence on a single location required an explanation he did not have. He noted the presence of the cat, which complicated every framework he had applied, because cats do not behave this way. He noted it and left it unresolved. The gate at Margaret's house, the gate that had been latched from the inside on the night Boaz disappeared 8 years before, was also left unresolved. No one returned to it. It had been documented in the original police report and set aside and never reopened. Margaret had never stopped thinking about it. She still did not have an answer for it. What she had was Boaz, who came home with her that Saturday afternoon and slept at the foot of her bed and waited by the door and sat beside her while she worked. For 14 weeks. And then one morning, she woke, and he was gone again, quietly, without announcement, without explanation, the way he had arrived. She said later that it was the most peaceful thing she had ever witnessed. She said she had not known she needed an ending until she got one. She had believed she had made peace with not knowing over those 8 years, and she had in a way. But she said there is a difference between making peace with an open wound and having it close. She had learned to carry the open question. What she had not known was how much of her energy had been going into the carrying. The food bowl is still in the same spot in the kitchen. She has not moved it. She says she will know when it is time. There is a woman named Carol who began volunteering at an animal rescue after that Saturday morning. Her cat came home and lived 2 more months. She is still volunteering. And there is a man named David who got his dog back after 2.5 years and does not have an explanation, and has said so publicly and does not seem to feel he needs one. There are 9 people who received back something they had stopped looking for. And there is this. In the 15th chapter of Luke, there is a story about a shepherd who has 100 sheep and loses one. He does not wait. He does not calculate the odds. He leaves the 99 who are fine, and he goes after the one that is missing. And he searches until he finds it. And when he finds it, he carries it home on his shoulders. And he calls everyone around him to celebrate, because the one that was lost has been found. And the point of the story, the thing that is supposed to stop us, is what comes next. That there is more joy over the one that was found than over all the ones who were never lost. Not equal joy, more. We tend to think loyalty is proportional. We give our attention to what is present, what is responding, what is showing returns. We are reasonable about loss. We reach a threshold of probability, and we adjust our expectations, and we move forward. And we call that wisdom. And sometimes it is. But the shepherd in that story is not being reasonable. He is not being proportional. He leaves the majority to look for the one, because to him, the one is not a fraction of something. The one is the whole point. Margaret did not claim that anything miraculous had happened. She was careful about that in every conversation. She said she did not know what to call it, though she said she knew what she had experienced, and she knew what she had seen. And she said that the morning Boaz appeared across the street from the farmer's market and turned and looked back at her one time. She had understood something she had not had words for before. That being lost and being forgotten are not the same thing. That something can know exactly where you are the entire time you believe yourself to be invisible. That sometimes what has been looking for you is not waiting for you to find it. It is walking to your street, and it is waiting for you to follow. If you are carrying something you stopped expecting to resolve, something you made peace with because peace was the only option, this is for you. Some things that go missing do come back. And some things that find you will have been looking far longer than you ever knew.